we replaced the lamb for cricket mints from Yumbug. And I think it's 17 times less carbon.
Once we've installed solar panels, we know what we can generate. Once we've returned on the initial capital investment, then effectively we're generating electricity for free.
But from the forum, I personally, I love coming to the meetings. It is really inspiring, really energizing. I think the forum is different to others because it's focused on action.
A fertiliser, which then is used on our fields for wheat generation, that's then harvested by one of our companies that's turned into flour that goes back to make our dough.
Because we're talking about sustainability and we're talking about big problems, we need to come together to come at solutions and come up with solutions for these massive problems.
Hi, I'm Bob Gordon, Director at Zero Carbon Forum. I'm here today with Claudia, Head of Responsible Business at Azzurri Group. Claudia, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Bob, and thank you for having me. Nice to be able to talk about Azzurri. I don't think people know exactly what we do, but we're the company behind well-loved national chains such as ZZS, Italian, Coco di Mama, and most recently Boujum. Present in around 200 different sites across the nation, but then we also have retail lines in some of our biggest supermarkets across UK and Ireland. So a little growing business, I would say.
Yeah, it's a great business. Tell me a little bit, just to get us started, on your business's relationship with sustainability. How have you got started? What have you been doing so far?
Yeah, easy question to start us off, but unfortunately I don't have an easy answer. Our relationship with sustainability. I would say that up to 2.5 years ago, it was a very reactive relationship with sustainability.
Okay.
But post-pandemic world meant that the business was ready to change. So 2.5 years, the business took a hard look at what Azzurri was and after the pandemic, and started a journey to redefine its purpose as a company. And that's when I came in. And that's when I was given the opportunity to review what sustainability meant to a group that was undertaking that purpose journey of redefining what mattered most to its people. So from my end, I was extremely lucky that I didn't have to go in and just come up with an action plan to reduce our emissions, but was given the opportunity to try to win over people's hearts and minds with carbon, something that we know is so easy to do.
Well, and so I think you and I would sit here saying we know carbon's really important, but I'm not sure that's true of everybody. So did you have to kind of weave carbon into the purpose? Was carbon already kind of written into the purpose? How was that kind of seen, and what else is in there in terms of that kind of ethical and responsible business?
Right. So we were lucky, or I was lucky to join the business, and the business already had a strong understanding that we needed to help combat climate change as part of the wider industry. So Azzurri is one of the founding members of the Zero Carbon Forum.
Yes.
I think you know a little bit about that.
Yeah.
So Azzurri already had started the journey, but when I joined, we hadn't done a carbon footprint. So we had the commitment, we had the right attitude towards it, but we hadn't done our homework. So carbon was part of what we were looking at, but we hadn't delved in depth as to what it meant for the business. We defined our impact across the pillars of people, planet, and plate. And obviously within people, our net zero commitment. So being a net zero business by 2040 is one of the shining lights of our planet pillar. But then we really viewed all of our environmental impact through that climate lens. So we also added commitments, of course, around reducing our energy and our waste, but also to make sure that all of our new restaurants or refurbishment projects would be done to the highest degree of sustainability criteria.
I completely agree, and I think it's an absolutely foundational cornerstone. So we'll talk a little bit in a moment about some of the things that you've done and engaging suppliers, particularly making reductions in the supply chain.
Yeah.
Just quickly talk about how you've managed to get that buy-in, how you've managed to corral the business around this purpose, or how your leadership team has enabled that.
Yeah, so again, lucky to have engaged leadership. So our board members are very engaged with the project, but we also have investors that are a B Corp themselves. So they have high expectations for us as a business. That bodes well for me. So having that leadership buy-in meant that then I could approach both our different departments more proactively and instill goals that didn't necessarily sit with my tiny department, because my tiny department is me. So create goals that would also be something that our supply chain teams would be able to pursue, that we would have different departments be able to meaningfully contribute, whether it's, again, supply chain, our construction, our commercial and property teams. We have really been able to embed that strategy across the department. So that has been helpful as well in terms of buying in team members. But then we also have brands, and that was a different conversation.
Yeah, okay. So, but just within that, there's buy-in and then there's application. So just super quickly in terms of how you get stuff done there. And have you written a kind of strategy in conjunction with leadership team, and then leadership team own any of those activities within it, and then that gets driven down into each of the departments?
Yeah, so we have, our Recipe for a Better Future is part of our company's value creation plan, so embedded in the overall strategy of the business. First of all, then we also have leaders who are pursuing actively some of our goals and have as personal learning objectives contributing overall strategy. So KPIs linked to sustainability within our directors as well. We've created separate ESG boards, sustainability boards for each of the brands to make sure that, again, we have that oversight from sustainability, that loose engagement, but also those KPIs and objectives woven into the business objectives of different departments and leaders. But then also each brand has its own governance board to pursue its own objectives.
Right. So your action plans are different at a brand level, but based on that thinking that's been done at a group level.
Correct. But I couldn't get brands to be excited about the same standard language, because even if we're part of the same family, they're all independent businesses, and it makes complete sense that they would want to feel special in their own way. But also from a
and the activity needs to align with what they're trying to achieve and the brand they're trying to build.
Exactly. So we needed to pull apart our goals after working so hard on creating them, but they had to be pulled apart so that we could then recreate them in the brand's image, so that they would resonate with each brand's own unique proposition, but also because it would be disingenuous to think that they would all care about the same things equally. Even if they're part of the Azzurri portfolio, they're still independent. But that obviously is how I've approached it, and I was really keen to make sure that we tied in our sustainability strategy and our values. But you obviously work with a lot of different businesses as part of the Zero Carbon Forum. What other strategies have you seen businesses pursue to be able to decarbonize?
I actually think it's a pretty well-trodden path now. I think it's fairly well understood about getting emotional buy-in, but also about linking to financial success, so that there's agreement and alignment at a senior level. Whether your driver is because you want to do the right thing, because you've seen a commercial opportunity, because your investors are asking questions, because you're concerned about what your employees, customers, other stakeholders think, there's a driver for you to act here, and it's all around setting that framework, getting that foundational thinking right of we want to be progressive here in whatever way we choose to do that. And then the well-trodden path to actually taking action follows very, very typically, and it's a format we follow at the Zero Carbon Forum: measure, plan, reduce. It's not just what gets measured gets managed. It's actually the process of understanding, measuring the things that matter, and then understanding where your hotspots are and the things that you can do about that. I could talk about that for hours, but but to turn that back to you, how have you done that within your business? Where have you started on measure, and then we'll go through to kind of talking about making a plan? And
well, funnily enough, because we committed to becoming a net zero business before having done a carbon footprint, I would say that our journey started by measuring. So
no, and like I say, it is a very well-trodden path. It is.
Not surprising on that one. But so we started by measuring. So we made our commitment. So we knew what the end goal was going to be. So then we carried out our first carbon footprint with a
And that's, sorry, just to be really clear, that primary step on measurement is a carbon footprint.
Yes. That's exactly where we started. So when we're talking about, we have different ways of measuring our multitude of goals, but when we talk about carbon with our net zero commitment, we had to go back to doing our first carbon footprint, on which we could then base our trajectory to achieve net zero, and also devise science-based targets to reduce our emissions. And after creating our first reports, we created our first net zero roadmap, published it as part of our sustainability strategy, and we started defining what actions we needed to take. But we kept it quite broad and vague because we knew that we were just at the start of our journey. But what I was able to do with that net zero roadmap and even the first couple of years of data was start to have conversations across the business about what it means to reduce carbon emissions. What is carbon? Why should we all care about it?
Yep.
Yeah, we started using zero carbon services the past year to then analyze 2 years worth of data in like 6 months. So we like to keep things ambitious because boring is the enemy of progress in this case. But we started working with Zero Carbon Services to look at our latest emissions data, and we were very lucky to be amongst the first to trial the visualization platform.
Yep.
So for the first time, we were able to get our fantastic data sets and put them onto a tool that would enable us to see our impact. So having it displayed meant that we could dig in so much deeper, and we started a process of interrogating everything. So we started working with Foodsteps in 2022 to analyze the emissions of our menus. And for us, Scope 3 in general is very big, but especially food represents 65% of our total carbon footprint for the past year. Thanks to the platform, we were also able to present our brands with their own footprints. But more importantly, we were able to identify the top 10 ingredients by emission factor for each.
So ultimately, for all that work, what it gets you is at a really high level, and just for the benefit of people who might be listening who don't understand scopes 1, 2, and 3. Scope 3 is your emissions predominantly within your supply chain. It's your indirect emissions, and certainly for hospitality, it's predominantly in production of food and drink.
Yeah.
So you're able to see, right, the bulk of my footprint is in food and drink, and then you're able to drill into, right, where are the hotspots? And you can do that, obviously, as you say, at a brand level. So you can then say for each brand, right, one might be interested in meat, another on dairy. Yeah. I mean, they're the likely hotspots.
Yeah. We had crockery as well, but it was in the non-food purchase goods and services.
Okay, interesting.
But it is interesting, isn't it? But that's what becomes, when carbon becomes interesting, is when you can see your business decisions come to life and the impact of those decisions.
And I guess that's back to that mantra of what gets measured gets managed. Was once you've done that measurement, you can see, okay, well, crockery's worth a conversation and meat, dairy's worth a conversation. Yeah. But from a carbon point of view, plastic straw is probably not worth so much for conversation.
No, but also it was positive to carry out the work with Zero Carbon Services because we were able to see across each scope the impact of our actions. So for instance, in Scope 3 again, we have carried out a lot of work to redesign our packaging lines for takeaway. But that meant that we also reduced our end-of-life emissions because we were able to quantify, for some of our businesses that have a significant amount of packaging lines, we were able to quantify our impact and see that the work that we had done actually reduced our emissions between 2 years. So after we've done all that analysis, we found a very interesting thing, which is we had reduced our emissions between financial year 22 and financial year 23, reduced our absolute emissions as well as intensity emissions measured by financial value. But then, so the intensity emissions we reduced by 10%.
Yeah.
We were very proud of that. But I was even happier when we could see that we actually reduced our intensity also by restaurant footprint. So it was a reduction across the board, and we could be proud in telling the story.
So your ability to be able to articulate a reduction year on year is actually relatively unique and really impressive. Can we talk a little bit about what you've done to achieve those reductions, in particular what you've done working with your supply base and how you've reduced your Scope 3 emissions?
Yeah, so definitely suppliers are so important and need to be part of the conversation. So Scope 3 reductions. We started engaging suppliers a year ago or so. So we first talked about our sustainable dining strategy with them. And we told them as well that there are many goals, but we really want to focus on top 3. And as part of those top 3, there was carbon reductions. And then we started conversation with suppliers and found out those that were more advanced in the journey because we opened the door and welcome conversations so that we could also take in not only the learnings, but also in some cases, their own supplier-specific carbon assessments.
Okay, great.
So LCAs, so those life cycle assessment and analysis of carbon emissions specific to products and ingredients came in super useful to us because we were able to combine both information from Foodsteps to improve our Scope 3 reporting, but also use supplier-specific information. So there is an element of product development. So with foodstuffs, we had been able to tweak some recipes to make sure that we were reducing carbon emissions of our vegan swaps, for instance, with Italian. But then we also managed to use and change some suppliers so that we could also promote and incentivize and really use suppliers who are committed to reducing carbon emissions. So we've started to link our commercial conversations and decisions to suppliers' abilities to demonstrate that they're reducing their carbon emissions, are leaders in their space, and ideally can also provide data to back it up.
Yeah, that's really interesting. How's that been received by suppliers? Do you think others are having conversations similar to that?
I think that's where we need to be. And so we started talking about this as part of the Zero Carbon Forum.
Yeah.
So as part of the Zero Carbon Forum, there are a variety of different working groups. I've been participating in a few, one of which has been about reductions of emissions in the dairy supply chain, and that has been super useful because I was able to then go back to my supplier and find out what is happening in that space.
Yeah, and that's something we are working up quite actively. So another one of our groups is the Engaging Suppliers Group,
yes.
And we seek to understand here. We've written some guidance on how to engage suppliers, but what we're trying to do now is push into this more pointy end of how are we all going to ask for similar things with a similar voice on a similar time scale so that the industry is aligned.
Exactly. We definitely need to work in that space. In terms of where I think the future is going to be in the next 1 to 2 years, it's going to be about bringing together food businesses and suppliers that are directly manufacturing and producing those ingredients that then we buy, because we need to have the same conversations and we need to make it clear that carbon needs to be part of those conversations.
Absolutely. And then to the point I think that you've already made is once we've got good relationships with those suppliers are then able to provide data that's relevant to their product rather than just industry averages. We're then able to see how that's changing. You can then make really well-informed decisions about which supplier you want to use because of their individual emissions factors and the journey that they're on and how much they've reduced it. So exactly. We then get better data, we get better systems, better decision-making processes across the entire sector rather than all acting in isolation.
And I don't want to penalize suppliers who might have a higher factor than averages. So we've seen from the information that we've obtained from foodstuffs, some of our sauces or some of our ingredients fare better than others and fare better than averages, but in some cases it just doesn't seem to be the case. But what we want to be able to do is then work with suppliers to reduce those emissions, not penalizing anyone, but just understanding better what we need to do in order to reduce those emissions together.
So we talked about dairy obviously as
yes.
a high emissions food. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've been doing with Wild Farmed and the sourcing of your dough?
You know what? I feel like you will have a second webinar. And I just want to say that we'll have all the answers about Wild Farmed in the second webinar, where we're going to talk about how leadership actually drove decision-making to reduce emissions in our Scope 3 reductions to the extent that we reduced one ingredient's emissions by 50%, and it affected 1/3 of our menu.
Yeah, wow. Okay.
So keep your eyes peeled for that.
Good. It's a good teaser for more good things to come.
Exactly.
How have you collaborated with the rest of the sector then?
Yes.
And I mean, obviously that's what we do at the Zero Carbon Forum, but talk a little bit about how you've worked with and learnt from your peers.
Yeah, so peer learning is so fundamental. So there are multiple ways of going about this. So we're obviously very lucky to have the Zero Carbon Forum. I particularly found the opportunities to network through these forums to be instrumental. I used to be a bit skeptical about the power of networking, but at the end of the day, because we're talking about sustainability and we're talking about big problems, we need to come together to come at solutions and come up with solutions for these massive problems. There's a lot of power in coming together at these forums, voicing concerns, issues, opinions, to then stimulate conversations that we can work together to make change happen. But also as a team of one, I really wouldn't be effective if I only relied on myself. So I need to rely on my peers on learning these forums, but also on a little bit of a spirit of positive competition.
I think you're so right. And the way that you express it as being a team of one.
Yeah.
The sustainability agenda is evolving so fast that you need to be plugged into how things are changing. I remember we had an all members meeting a few months back where the venue was right around the corner from a coffee shop. And as I was walking in, I saw you with a couple of sustainability leads from other pizza restaurants. And it was like, yes, this is exactly, you'd met beforehand to come together and have a conversation, exactly as you say, about the things the common issues that you're all facing, challenges you're all facing. So,
exactly.
yeah.
We cannot be alone. We need to make carbon fun, and we need to come together to find solutions.
Claudia, thank you. Just one more question.
Yeah.
If you had one bit of advice for people trying to make progress on their sustainability journey, what would it be?
Have fun, make it fun. We've had so much fun talking about carbon today. But yes, I do feel that carbon needs to be fun because climate change is a big, scary notion. We're fighting an incredibly hard fight, and I feel like to be constructive and productive, I don't want us at Azzurri to come from a place of fear, but I want us to come from a place of, instead of feeling empowered, inspired, and especially that we can play around with it a little bit. So I try to make it fun, I try to be engaging, and try to make things be memorable. And perhaps people will go home afterwards and talk about it over wine with their loved ones, and that's where I think change really happens.
It's a really lovely kind of action-focused, positive, inspiring, positive energy rather than the scale of the challenge in front of us.
Yeah.
I think it's the way to motivate and inspire people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob.
It's been a
Let's
pleasure.
have more fun.
Yeah.